What is it? It is passion and style, heritage and diversity, creativity and innovation. It is about making exceptional things, talent, inspiration, engineering, design. We know how to make life worthwhile. Curiosity and dedication, bravery and imagination, expertise and precision. Vision, we've got it, but there's so much more to it. We think big while tackling the smallest details. We're imagining future paths while being inspired by our living past. We're builders, innovators, artists and scientists, but as you can see, there's still so much more to it. Everyday visionaries, original and refined, stubbornly authentic, with unmatched quality on our mind. We are all this, and you can be too. Every time you live it, wear it, feel it, taste it, you'll know it's true. It is our brand, cool and unique. Italy is simply extraordinary. Be it.
We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swast India. Our session partner is Istituto Italiano di Cultura. It's our pleasure to present now A Pandemic of Denialism, Donatella Lippi and Shekhar Seshadri, in conversation with Roger Highfield. Academic and author Donatella Lippi and academic and psychiatrist Shekhar Seshadri take a deep dive into the history of denialism within pandemics throughout world history, weaving together a historical and psychological narrative. The two critically examine the reasons for which we react the way we do, whether it be in the 14th century with the bubonic plague or now in the 21st century with COVID-19. Lippi is a professor of history of medicine at the University of Florence. Seshadri is a former senior professor and former head of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and former dean of the Behavioral Sciences Division and former director at NIMHANS, Bengaluru. In conversation today with Roger Highfield, they discuss the past, present, and future of the pandemic and the human response to this calamity. Donatella Lippi is a scholar of classics specializing in archaeology, history of medicine, and bioethics. A full-time professor of history of medicine at Florence University, Lippi has authored more than 400 publications. Shekhar Seshadri is a child psychiatrist with over 35 years of experience in this field. His work has extended beyond the clinical population to children and childcare, institutions, service providers across India and South Asia. The NIMHANS Community Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service Project, conceptualized and initiated by Dr Seshadri, has now extended into the national initiative SAMVAD, supported by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India. Roger Highfield is the science director at the Science Museum Group. He studied chemistry at the University of Oxford and was the first person to bounce a neutron off a soap bubble. Highfield was the science editor of the Daily Telegraph for 2 decades and editor of New Scientist between 2008 and 2011. He's a member of the Medical Research Council, a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a visiting professor at the University of Central London and Oxford. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Please do follow our social media handles to get notifications on all the upcoming sessions. Do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag @JaipurLitFest. Ladies and gentlemen, A Pandemic of Denialism, Donatella Lippi and Shekhar Seshadri in conversation with Roger Highfield.
Well, it's great to be back at the JLF with Shekhar and Donatella to discuss denialism. I actually work at the Science Museum in London, and we've got a long-standing interest in this. If you go to our giant medicine galleries, you can see where we tell the centuries-long story of vaccination. We've even got lancets used by Edward Jenner in his smallpox vaccinations 200 years ago. And we also know from our research around the collections that the roots of the anti-vax movement go very deep indeed. And in fact, we're also doing an exhibition about the development of the COVID vaccines with colleagues in China and the National Science Center in Delhi. And the picture behind me is of the first vial of the AstraZeneca vaccine used in the UK. And of course, that same vaccine is made by the Serum Institute of India. Now, it really struck me when I last talked to our distinguished advisory board that a couple of them who were actually working in hospital wards just said to exactly the same thing, that everyone who was in intensive care was unvaccinated. So I think that's one reason of several why this sort of pandemic of denialism, the subject of today's discussion, is so important. So first of all, I'd like to ask Shekhar and Donatella, what exactly do we mean by denialism? You know, what's the difference between being anti-vaccine and being understandably cautious about using a brand new vaccine that's been developed in record time? Donatella, would you like to start with that?
Thank you for this question. I think that it's a very thorny question because it's not so easy to distinguish between to be cautious and to be anti-vaccine. But why? Because people invoke ecological arguments, prejudices against a large pharmaceutical industry and the big brother state. But I think that some bad examples from the past have brought about mistrust. This is the problem, this mistrust towards pharmaceutical companies. I am thinking, for instance, of the case of thalidomide, which was produced in 1957, for instance. Pregnant women who assumed this substance gave birth to babies with very severe malformations. And this created mistrust. As far as vaccines are concerned, in 1998, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, with 12 of his colleagues, published a scientific, between quotations, scientific paper in The Lancet, one of the most authoritative medical journals in the world. And in this paper, they assumed to have discovered a connection between autism and the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination. After 12 years, The Lancet was forced to retract this article because meanwhile it had been demonstrated that this assumption was really untrue. But it was too late. It was too late because many parents seeking a cause for their children's disease seized upon the apparent link between autism and the routine vaccination. And this had terrible consequences because people refused to have their children vaccinated. I understand that these parents were vulnerable. They were looking for a reason for, and they used vaccination as a scapegoat.
Right.
But,
So that,
yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
That also the vaccine obligation has bothered some populations.
I know you've got lots of fascinating examples through history about denialism in medicine, and maybe we'll return to those a little bit later. Shekhar, what have you got to say about the distinguishing between anti-vax and just being a bit cautious about something new? And what do you think about the trust issue raised by Donatella?
Roger, I would like to take the issue a little further back from the context of the vaccine to the human issue of denial itself. And as we speak, Mr. Novak Djokovic in the Australian Open and the controversy around his vaccination status and his position on vaccination and his incarceration, as it were, and going to court and all of that, that drama as it is slowly resolving, I'm reminded of Keith Kahn Harris's book, Denial, the Unspeakable Truth, in which he says that denialism is a terrible term and no one calls themselves a denialist and no one signs up for all forms of denialism. In fact, denialism is founded on the assertion that it is not denialism. And the concept of denial from psychoanalysis and Freud, so in the wake of Freud, as Keith Kahn Harris says, or at least a vulgarization of Freud, no one wants to be accused of being in denial. And the labeling of people as denialists seems to compound the insult by implying that they have taken the private sickness of denial and turned it into a public dogma. But the fact, Roger, is that denial and denialism are very closely linked. And the reason why we need to examine this linkage is, we are all in denial, some of the time at least. That's part of being human, and living in society with other human beings. And we find clever ways to express or conceal our feelings, using either the most sophisticated diplomatic language or the boldest lie and research and publications. So deceptions are not necessarily malignant, as Mr. Harris says. In fact, you recall Richard Sennett, who argued that in practicing social civility, you keep silent about things you know clearly, but which you should not say or do not say. So denialism, Roger, is an expansion, an intensification of denial. So at the root, they are both simply a subset of the many ways humans have developed to use language to deceive others and themselves. So denialism is just one other manifestation of the humdrum intricacies of our deceptions, or self-deception, shall we say. So denial...
That's fascinating. I mean, it does play, chimes with this point that vaccines have been met with suspicion and hostility for as long as they've existed. And so you're saying, in effect, it's very much part of the human condition to see this phenomenon.
Exactly. So in short, denial is fertile and routine, and denialism is combative and extraordinary. Denial hides from the truth, and denialism builds a new and what they think is a better truth.
So, Donatella, you I know have done lots of research on denialism in the past in the medical sphere with all these players, the governments, the ruling classes, common people. How do you give us some insights you've got into the phenomenon and the what these individual players or these governmental players do and how that shapes the debate?
I like this question indeed. Well, first of all, I take the liberty of making a very short distinction between two different practices. The first one is varialization, and the second one is vaccination. The first attempt of preventing smallpox was named varialization because it was based on the inoculation of human smallpox. The spread of this practice is due to a woman, and I'm very proud to remind it. This woman was the wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople, and her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She had seen the practice of varialization implemented in the East through the intranasal insufflation or the subcutaneous implantation of pulverized human smallpox crusts. She had seen that people who underwent this practice did not get sick. So when she came back to England, she had her children inoculated in this way, and many people wanted to follow her example. However, Catholic European culture did not approve this system because it was practiced by a pagan population, Turkish women, and because it was inconceivable to challenge God's will and God's plan. However, enlightened governments, so ruling class, open-minded ruling classes, decided to try and to make experiments. In Florence, in 1757, the government decided to make these experiments. 10 children who were recovered in the Foundling Hospital. They didn't belong to anybody. There were no parents who would cry for them. They were bled, they were purged, and they were inoculated.
I'm not sure that would get ethical approval today, Donatella, but go on, continue.
No. Informed consent did not exist. And all of them died. All of them died because the smallpox matter was taken from adult individuals who were recovered in the general hospital nearby, and they, in addition to smallpox, they transmitted to these children many other infectious agents. And so the negative results stopped the experiments. The really turning point occurred when Edward Jenner discovered the effectiveness of inoculating the cowpox, as you have mentioned before. But also in this case, the reaction of the church was negative, because the Pope and Pope Pius VII, the one who abolished the Napoleon Code and closed the Jews in the ghettos, he said that it was not fair to contaminate men who is similar to God with animal substances. But the system worked. The system worked, and there was a doctor from Milan who had a very brilliant idea. He wrote a pamphlet supporting vaccination. Now we can use the word vaccination from Latin vacca, which means cow. So every prevention means is named vaccination in honor of this practice. He wrote a pamphlet supporting vaccination, but he didn't sign it on himself. He said, he claimed that it had been written by the bishop of a German town, Goldsbeck. But neither the bishop nor the city existed. But everybody fell in the trap. And so if a bishop had stated that vaccination was positive, the church accepted vaccination. And smallpox in 1980 was considered defeated.
I think there's a great example, actually, that one of my colleagues, about Sir Ian Blatchford, who's the boss of the whole museum group, came across. He was studying the life of the Victorian scientist and politician Lyon Playfair, and he was a sort of government chief scientist of the day. He was convinced by the work of Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine and the vivid experience of the disease in the UK and across Europe. And it was interesting looking at what happened in the regulatory sphere in the UK. There was a Vaccination Act in 1853, and that was tightened and tightened and tightened until 1871. And then there was a pushback that for some Victorians, the laws marked an infringement of civil liberties. And actually in 1898 in the UK, there was a new Vaccination Act, and that had a conscientious objector clause where people could exempt their children from vaccination and so on. Now, of course, we all know the story's sort of got a happy ending, because despite the opposition to vaccination, smallpox was eradicated, you know, from the world 100 years after the Anti-Vaccination League was set up in the UK. But it's fascinating, this balance between civil liberties and, you know, individual benefits and benefits for the society. Donatella, what do you think about that? And then it'll be good to bring Shekhar in as well on that balance.
I think that I would like to make another example, a more recent example. In 1902, following a smallpox epidemic, the city of Cambridge in Massachusetts forced all citizens to get vaccinated. A man named Henning Jacobson refused to be vaccinated on the ground that this law violated his personal freedom to heal and to treat his own body. There was a lawsuit against Jakobson. He was convicted, he was punished. Jakobson appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court in 1905 upheld the Cambridge ruling, elaborating the principle that in the event of a threat to public health, the public good was greater than any individual freedom. And I support this point of view because I think that we have no sense of collective responsibility. We cannot manage this situation with the same laws as during everyday normal life. This is an emergency.
So, Shekhar, how do you see getting the balance right between benefits for the individual and benefits for the society at large?
Roger, denial and denialism have existed for a very long time, not just in the context of health, but in many other contexts. And we know that the term denialism has been used in the context of the Holocaust, in the controversy of the flatliners, people who believe that the earth is flat. But vaccines remain one of our most critical public health interventions. And as Donna was pointing out, there are an increasingly vocal group of anti-vaccinists, who call the vaccines toxic and attribute a lot of conditions. And since we're having this conversation in the context of the Jaipur Lit Fest, I must tell you about another book which was written by Michael Specter called Denialism, and how irrational thinking hinders scientific process, harms the planet, and threatens our lives. So the whole scholarship, as it were, on denialism and professional writing on it is actually not in the context of the pandemic. This has been going on for the last 15 years. And the kind of conditions that have been attributed, even autism, for example, that vaccination causes autism. And in fact, Michael Specter makes a very interesting point when he says, former Playboy model Jenny McCarthy is viewed as a respected source of information, whereas pediatric infectious diseases researcher Paul Offit receives death threats for his scientific contributions. And so that's why the journalist Michael Specter describes this phenomena of denialism in his book Irrational Thinking. That now, what has happened in the pandemic? Donna has covered the history and the background, starting from smallpox and varialization so well. But if you really look at the pandemic compared to the Spanish influenza, which of course took upwards of 50 million lives, and the mortality was much higher then, and with Delta and Omicron and all of that, the universal or the international nature of this pandemic and the kind of uncertainty that it causes from a mental health perspective, there is a pan-diagnostic term which we call as intolerance of uncertainty. And the relationship between denialism and intolerance of uncertainty, when you really do not know what helps and the impact on the vaccination, and the other struggle that has gone on, particularly in population-dense countries like India, where the whole vaccination, the vaccine politics and the availability of the vaccine, despite the public health approaches, that so denialism as kind of denial writ large, as Specter says, when an entire segment of society often struggling with this whole trauma of the pandemic kind of turns away from reality in favor of what he describes as a more comfortable lie. So it kind of describes this rejection of fact-based reality in many areas of health and medicine. So it could be mistrust of the pharmaceutical companies, or it could be, differences in medical research, to, obsessions with different kinds of treatments. So if we want to look at the future, so, there is the history, there is the current reality, and we look at the future. this whole denialism about the creation of life itself, and why we must overcome denialism and embrace change to continue advancing as a society, or there is peril to survival and health issues. So this is a framework that we need to keep in mind to really continue our dialogue in public health spaces. And this is where media and for health professionals to communicate with civil society and the public to address the misinformation and the anxieties which lead to a culture of denialism, as it were, as a process, not as a single piece of information, but it's a process that has to continue and evolve over a period of time to address this kind of irrational thinking that hinders scientific process. Roger?
I think I'd like to pick up a little bit more about what we can do about denialism later. One thing that fascinates me is you can see that vaccine uptake varies a lot from country to country. Now, some of it is sadly very practical, and we know that lower and middle income countries are struggling to get their fair share of vaccine. But of course, there are other issues about trust in government, about numeracy, about links with populism and so on. I certainly feel that, say, in the US, there's much more overt denialism than in the UK. What does this variation between different political regimes and so on tell us about those countries and denialism?
If you look at countries from the perspective of public health and how robust public health systems are on the one hand, and particularly in their relationship with systems of governance, availability, accessibility, and affordability. What has happened in India, for example, is that the large rollout of the vaccination, there is the hope and the assumption that it will kind of ease out the class and economic boundaries and make this available to. Now, the availability of the vaccine and its cost factors and the fact that it is more or less being given out free of cost across the population does not necessarily address the kind of health assumptions, health misinformation, and health beliefs that people have about not just a vaccination, even going to a health facility and getting that jab. So there is a background that an average person comes from, and his or her own ideas about health, disease, its causality, and the impact of the vaccination, how long that will last, what is this infection, where did it come from? So there is so much of information around on the media, in newspapers, in public spaces, in homes and families, well-meaning relatives who are calling and telling you what to do, what not to do. That the kind of confusions that it creates is one form or one construct in which this denial kind of plays out. Now, one would assume that in the so-called high-income countries, that this issue is not there. But this is a matter that is, it's kind of surprising us that denialism is not now an Elmic issue. And this brings me back to the very old notion of culture and mental health that people spoke about, depression and linguistic competence and so on, that depression manifests separately in Occidental cultures as opposed to Oriental cultures there. But what the pandemic has done is that it's kind of even this out in a manner of speaking. So it doesn't matter whether you're high income or low income. It doesn't matter what kind of governance you have, what kind of accessibility. Denialism seems to be a universal phenomenon.
Yeah. Although I have to say, I've seen some really interesting studies looking at denialism through different lenses. So there was a 2019 study by Jonathan Kennedy at Queen Mary University of London, and he found a link between the percentage of people who voted for populist parties within a country, and the percentage who believe that vaccines are not important and not effective. And with this, I think there's quite a lot of medical literature that shows a connection between vaccine hesitancy and a distrust of big pharma and a distrust of government and so on. I think another study showed a link between those who are reluctant to get the vaccine and extreme political parties as well. And I suppose just to return to both of you, this very important question about what to do about it, I wanted to frame this question in the context of a study of Facebook users that was published in Nature a couple of years ago, which I must admit I found rather alarming, because they looked at anti-vaccine sentiment and pro-vaccine sentiment among 100 million people on Facebook, and they found these sort of clusters, interconnected clusters. And although they were smaller in size, the anti-vax clusters were much more entangled with what they classified undecided people as the pro-vaccination clusters, which they found were a bit more peripheral. And they predicted that anti-vaccine sentiment will continue to grow and will dominate in a decade, fueled by social media. So I suppose, Donatella first, what can we learn from the past about how to counter sometimes irrational beliefs or lack of belief in vaccines?
It's a very sad story, because if we look backwards, story is full of examples of witches who were burnt at the stake because they supported a correct aptitude towards many health problems. So, but I can make a positive example. In 1478, in Florence, a great epidemic of Black Death spread. And some people decided to live on the countryside, where the density of population was lower and it was possible to survive. Among them, there was a philosopher who was a friend of Lorenzo the Magnificent. His name was Marsilio Ficino. He was a doctor, and he was ashamed to have escaped from Florence, leaving his patients alone. So he decided to write a book. He wrote it not in Latin, but in Vulgar, in order to be understood by not the population, of course, but by a greater amount of people. And he gave suggestions which I assure you we could adopt even in nowadays, because he suggested to use vinegar to wash the hands and the mouth. He suggested to keep aside from the neighbor at least of 2 Italian Florentine arms. So it was necessary to take measures before starting a conversation. He said it was necessary to wash sheets, blankets, and so on, and to cover the mouth with a special mask. The mask contained a sponge. The sponge was dipped into very aromatic substances because the contagion was believed to be transmitted by air. In this case, Marsilio Ficino's advertising was successful, but we have plenty of examples of stories which didn't have a positive end. I don't know what we can do to limit the damage of disinformation and misinformation, but I agree with Shekhar. He has rightly stressed the importance of communication. But yeah, obviously, there are more people who follow Facebook than the serious journals, and have the tools of understanding, not scientific, but articles which can be shared by common people and have solid, strong scientific basis.
So Shekhar, I mean, it's such an interesting question, the impact of social media. And Shekhar, you know, you mentioned some of the ways that you could get around denialism. Are there any more insights we get? I think there are these ideas, for example, prebunking, which seems to be to sort of vaccinate people with the right ideas before they get exposed to the wrong ideas, or some of the experience that we've had from dealing with climate denialism, where you find paradoxically that the more facts you bombard people with, the more you entrench their anti, climate change views, which is, Shekhar, just talk us through whether there are any other insights and tools that we might be able to use to shift attitudes.
I'll build on what you're saying, Roger. In fact, I had happened to read a viewpoint which was published in the European Journal of Public Health, Pascal Diethelm and Martin McKee, way back in 2009. And it's very interesting when they start by saying HIV does not cause AIDS. Smoking does not cause cancer. And if climate change is happening, it has nothing to do with man-made carbon dioxide emissions. And as Donna was pointing out, each of these can be easily found in the mass media. So, your point on debunking, the issue, Roger, is that the consequences of policies based on such views can be fatal. We all know, for example, when Thabo Mbeke's denial that HIV caused AIDS, thousands of HIV-positive mothers receiving antiretroviral and unnecessarily transmitted the disease to their children. And his own health minister, Manto Shavalala, famously rejected the evidence of the efficacy of these drugs instead advocating treatment with garlic, beetroot, and African potato. And it's ironic, Pascal and Martin say that their departure from office coincided with the award of the Nobel Prize to Luc Montagnier and Francois Barré-Sinoussi for their discovery that HIV is indeed the case of AIDS. So this rejection of scientific evidence sometimes is a bit of a problem. So defining and recognizing denialism and debunking some of the anti-vaccination, the whole and the mechanism that they use, for example, the processes that they use, the conspiracy process that the scientifics have independently studied the evidence and they are engaged in some complex and secretive conspiracy, and peer review process is seen as a tool by which conspirators suppress dissent. And sometimes denialism exploits genuine concerns such as rejection of or the variant of the conspiracy theory, and Pascal and Martin call it inversionism, by which one's own characteristics and motivations are, and this is typical in the tobacco industry, for example. So what we really need to do is when we recognize these kind of mechanisms, the misrepresentations, the logical fallacies that take place, and how do we respond to this? We know that denialists are driven by a range of motivations, whether it's greed or corporate issues, or by ideology or faith, causing to reject anything that is incompatible with their fundamental beliefs, or whether it is just eccentric and whimsical, or the media maverick, or some hi-fi known celebrity, whatever the motivation may be. I think it's important when we recognize denialism, when we are confronted with it, we need to recognize it. And the normal academic response to an opposing argument is to engage with it.
Yeah.
And engage with it not just in scientific journals, but engage with it. And media and what the pandemic has done is the digital world and the online medium now is absolutely the way that we need to use,
right,
to address the phenomena that we're dealing with. this shift is very necessary. The shift to address the kind of information that is prevailing and to provide the, it reminds me of a very important line that Messala states in the famous Hollywood movie Ben-Hur, when Judah Ben-Hur is becoming very famous. And Stephen Boyd, who plays Messala, says, how do you fight an idea? You fight an idea with another idea.
Right.
And that's what we need to do.
Now, we've only got a few minutes to go, and there's just two more questions I'd like to ask. And actually, Shekhar, you started to look at one of them, which is, of course, how do you strike the right balance between free speech and suppressing nonsense? Do you want to quickly pick up on that, and then I'll bring Donatella in before the final question?
I think if one creates a forum where the detractors and the proactive people are in a common platform, and we come from a position of belief that civil society fundamentally is not stupid. We can't come with an assumption. This is it's disrespectful, and it trivializes and minimizes the basic intelligence of the public to ultimately accept a rational judgment if it is presented in a manner that respects their agency and respects their intelligence. And so you allow for them to put the questions, and for a facilitator, a moderator, an ombudsman, as it were, to kind of weigh this evidence and present an argument that is not just scientific and rational, but which respects the agency and intelligence of the child, of the audience, and gets them to then accept a behavioral choice, a health choice, which they believe is not just in personal interest, but in the larger interest of the community. So it has to be phrased that way.
We have to win their hearts and their minds. Donatella, just very briefly, before we have to wrap up, any fascinating historical insights into that balance between suppressing nonsense and encouraging free speech?
Well, if we can take the example of what happened during the plague epidemics in Italy in the past, when the word plague was forbidden, as nowadays in Turkmenistan the word COVID-19 is forbidden. I think that this attempt was managed by the ruling classes, who tried to address the public opinion towards their point of view. I mean, in every epidemics, the theory of conspiracy spread, and this was nonsense, obviously, but in turn, the Jews, the people who lived in marginalization, widows, assumed witches, they were blamed for infecting people, but this was nonsense. And the only way they used to stop this spreading of misinformation and disinformation was to use the power of strength. That is, in Milan, there was the column, the infamous column, where people supposed to have infected other people were punished under everybody's eyes. Otherwise, in the past, silence was the only way to address the public opinion, because it was forbidden to. It was dangerous because of economical impliances. Because when the state of epidemic was declared, the towns, the commerce were dying out. And so the governments tried to keep the news under silence, under the wrap. And when it became of public opinion, this was a great problem, because the ring of the bell towers, the bells of the ring towers were rang in alarm. It was a very terrific sound. And then the guards were ordered to check the entrances in the town. So it was, there were very severe economic consequences in the case of plaque. The social upheaval was one of them. So it was necessary to keep everything under silence, to prevent, make it maybe prebunking instead of debunking.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we better draw it to a close there. I mean, just to say on that point, Donatella, it's fascinating looking at the more libertarian approaches, say in the UK versus those in the Far East. And obviously you've got to cut your cloth according to what your citizens can put up with. I was going to talk about the Omicron phase of the pandemic, and I suppose I'd just with one parting thought before I wrap up, which is I think there's been a bit of a failure of imagination about how important it is to deal with denialism, because if Omicron has told us anything, is that even though it's a milder disease, if it was as deadly as MERS, say for example, which kills a third of people it infects, then the impact on society would be catastrophic. So we have to understand why people reject vaccines. We have to get more people to take them up. But there, sadly, I've got to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Shekhar. Thank you so much, Donatella, for your brilliant comments. And thanks as ever to the wonderful JLF. Wonderful to be back, and back to our host.
Thank you, Donatella, Lippi, Shekhar Seshadri, and Roger Highfield for sharing deeply intriguing insights into the human response to the pandemic. Our session partner today was the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Do stay logged on and continue to watch with us the great sessions and series that we have specially curated for you. Please do stay tuned on now for the JLF Writer Shorts and the next sessions.